So, hello everyone. What we'll talk about today is moving beyond the Pepsi challenge. So, evaluation and assessment of security tool effectiveness, or really testing, the testers, for example. So, who am I? Joe Slowik. Currently, I'm a threat hunter working at Dragos, an ICS-oriented security company. Prior to that, I was running the incident response team at Los Alamos National Lab. I was an information warfare officer in the U.S. Navy prior to that, and ultimately, for the philosophy track, I was a philosophy grad school dropout at the University of Chicago. So, come a long way, but here I am. So what we'll talk about, a little bit of background for what the situation encompasses, the motivation for doing a talk such as this. We'll talk about that Pepsi challenge and how it actually really is relevant to how we look at the evaluation of security tools, and then probe for some solutions. After all, we're trying to come up with ways of driving us beyond art and into science. So why do I care? So currently, I work for a vendor. I know, please don't throw anything at me, but it's a really good vendor, trust me. But prior to that, I was security operations and responsible for testing and procurement of equipment within an incident response environment. So the result is, I'm very familiar with both sides of this argument, both how do you allegedly position a product, as well as what do you look for when you're trying to acquire something. Now, the procurement dilemma for anyone who's involved in security operations is pretty simple. So we need tools, but we don't have infinite budgets, we don't have infinite time. So given limitations, what do we have to work with? Well, first off, a wrong decision can be quite consequential. So as a result, if you make a wrong decision, you just spent a fairly big chunk of your budget on a shit product, for lack of a better description, and you're stuck with that product for its life cycle, because chances are you only get one bite at the apple every time it comes time to procure a new security device, a new piece of equipment, et cetera. It's kind of like hiring, actually, but that's a whole nother discussion. The result is that we have a slow procurement process with a really strong emphasis on getting it right, but not very many chances to do so. So if you make that mistake, you end up paying for it, not just once, but over a period of time. My recent motivation for this talk originally started out as like some very bitter social media posts that I then deleted because I realized that would have been a very terrible idea. But the gentleman here, Dale Peterson, who ran a conference I was just at a couple of weeks ago, S4 and ICS Security Conference, put together an ICS detection challenge to try and get all of these different vendors in the room and evaluate them based upon objective data. Well, that sounds reasonable, like, hey, we want to get an idea for how these products work, let's run them against each other and see what happens. The main thing, though, aside from this being in Miami Beach in January, which is a horrible thing, is looking at how this is defined. So, an objective test. That's a loaded word in my opinion, because objectivity implies that this is something that should hold to a fairly good degree across a multitude of cases. And is that really the situation? Quite simply, in this particular case, it was not. So the specific example for the data that was used in this test was taking a network and evaluating anomaly detection based upon a anonymized, and not really revealing how this was anonymized, which can add artifacts into the data as well, packet capture traffic. And then plug a bunch of things in, read PCAP, and see what spits out. But what if your product doesn't do that necessarily? What if you're not doing anomaly analysis or detection, and based upon what anomalies are popping up, is that even relevant to your product design or product model? And especially if the rest of the market is clustered around one idea and you have an outlier, think the same thing with antivirus products between your traditional blacklisting solutions and some of your newer machine learning AI style solutions. How do you get around this when you have people approaching the problem differently, but you have a data set that's focused only on one aspect of it? So really focusing on what measurement are we using to try to evaluate efficacy in this case, and how does that color the results, so to speak? So this was brought up in other forums. The discussion moved to Twitter and quickly evolved into a very unproductive flame war. There was some, my boss going against some other company bosses or whatever about like, oh, you're a coward for not doing this. So basically, pro tip, never discuss subjects that require nuance and some level of specificity on a platform such as Twitter. I really wish that certain important people would take that to heart, but that's a whole other discussion. So, this isn't just, I'm talking about a very specific segment of the market, and a very small one at that, industrial control systems. But this applies to security tools across the spectrum. So general security testing, Magic Quadrants, if anyone works for that organization, you can meet me out back later, I guess, I don't know. And the general shit show that is antivirus testing. So where you have seemingly arbitrary criteria and a lack of relevance to how these products are actually put in place in operational environments. So when it comes to AV testing is a really good example that does impact all of us. We like to get some idea that the product we're investing in is going to detect the bad things. But, testing, sort of by its nature, is always taking a one-size-fits-all approach. But not all threat models are the same. Furthermore, the products, especially as we're moving into more advanced types of detection, more advanced sorts of products, you've got your blacklisting approaches, your machine learning approaches, your heuristic approaches, all are looking at the same things. So if you have a product that's designed to detect things through machine learning or adaptation to the environment, and you give it a test set of malicious binaries, it's probably not going to look all that well because it wasn't designed to detect things in this fashion, whereas something that's a traditional blacklisting approach or a heuristic approach will be just fine. So being able to realize what it is that the testing framework is applying and how it's being used is very important in order to interpret the results, because all these products in some fundamental way operate a little bit differently. So for a real-world example, this is something that I worked on recently, TRISIS, the Industrial Control System Safety System Infecting Malware. This is a piece of malware. It's something that's of vital importance to an industrial control system environment. No AV product out in the field, at least nothing that's being shared up on VirusTotal, caught this at all. Now, am I trying to say that AV is bad? No, but what I am saying is that in a very specific tailored environment where you had something that any ICS analyst looked at this, I mean, I looked at the binary and instantly it's like, whoa, this is not cool. But the threat models that were involved in designing these products didn't pick it up. So as a result, these tests on efficacy don't really apply in the case of where you would see something like this pop up. So, looking at tests, objectivity is something that we should strive to do for, but is it really an objective test if the data involved really makes sure that the testing criteria only applies to very certain specific situations based upon how you're designing your test set? And Velociraptor agrees with me. So the takeaway here is, the test is only as valuable as what it's measuring. And sort of as a thing to keep note of, and that's kind of dangerous, especially when you're looking at how products develop over time, is that there's an incentive to teach to the test. That if I know that I'm going to be evaluated by these criteria, I want to make sure I'm designing my product in such a way that it scores well on this metric, but that metric may not be what you need in your environment or even match your threat environment whatsoever. So rating the test and figuring out what that tells you is just as important as whatever rating you get on a certain product. Now, we'll talk about the Pepsi challenge, because this is a really good analog for what we're talking about with respect to security products. So the Pepsi challenge is a semi-famous case of a taste test head-to-head between Pepsi and Coca-Cola back in the late 70s, early 80s. I'm foggy on that right now. Disclosure, I have an MBA. I don't know how that happened, but we can talk about that later. So this has come up in some other professional areas for me as well, but the main thing is that the test was organized around small sample sizes. So you had a little sippy cup or a little paper cup of Pepsi, a little paper cup of Coke, take a sip, which one's better? Well, Pepsi designed this test that benefited their product in a way. Maybe they did so unintentionally or intentionally, but your realistic situation is you're drinking some product over a period of time and finishing the whole thing, which it's soda, it's not good for you, but you're probably going to finish it. Whereas the test is oriented around a small sample size of a single product. Now, the result of the Pepsi challenge, because Pepsi had a sweeter formula that people found more pleasurable in smaller sample sizes instead of drinking 12 ounces of it, was Coke lost this fairly dramatically, and so they came up with this monstrosity, New Coke. Who remembers New Coke? Yes, okay, so New Coke came out, and what was the result of New Coke? You had a lot of really pissed off people over soda, which boggles the mind in certain respects. But anyway, Coke shifted strategy to match what Pepsi was doing based upon a test that caught mind share within the market. The result was they pissed off their customers to the point where you had people protesting over soda, which is ridiculous, but in this case, yes, the test made them do something that was contrary to their business. So what's the security lesson from this? There really is one. So as Condescending Wonka will tell us, tell me again about your industry-leading security product. What exactly is it leading, and by what criteria are you designing that measurement? Because if it's based upon something that's either artificial in terms of how it's constructed or not applicable to your environment, you're not really leading something that's relevant to what my use cases would be for a given product or device. So, teaching to the test in this case for Coke versus Pepsi resulted in a product that the people Coke should be caring about, their consumers, their user base, so to speak, didn't like. It was an undesired product. Consumers were, as a result, worse off than before, as if this never happened and Coke had simply stayed put, resulting in Coke Classic coming out. And the narrow test criteria involved in this one very influential test resulted in skewed results that didn't reflect the reality of the situation at hand. Okay, so we've talked about how testing is bad, but we still need to figure out some way of making these decisions in a smart and presumably objective fashion. So what do we do? So far this has been kind of a depressing discussion. I've told you right now that none of these measurements matter, but you really need to get these decisions right. So, please, how do we get about resolving the problem? Well, we need to evaluate products, and we need to do so quickly and efficiently, but all these industry standards really lead to certain artificial biases that go unrecognized and undiagnosed in most cases, which could lead to making decisions that are detrimental to your security posture. So for starters, you don't simply evaluate all solutions by the same criteria. So thinking that solution A and solution B can operate the same across all environments universally is already going to bring in some artificial constructs into the discussion and likely lead you down the wrong path towards some misleading answers. So what you want to do is frame the discussion. So tests, evaluations, assessments, they should be based upon scenarios. What is the threat environment that I'm facing? What are the realistic aspirations for what this product is going to do in my environment? Then, when it comes to evaluating test input, because I'm not saying that tests are necessarily irrelevant, but rather you need to understand what a given test measures so that you can frame it within what your requirements are and what you need it to tell you. So once you know the applicability and suitability of whatever is being measured, you can then apply that to the sort of metrics that you need for your environment. So this is just adding one data point and adding the proper context around it so that you can get a more solid answer. Yes?
What's your feeling on the number of variables a specific test can evaluate?
So in terms of, yes, so in terms of the number of variables that a specific test can or should, I'm sorry.
The answer is what it can and therefore how many you should include.
Right. So when it comes to this product evaluation, multiple data points is obviously good. When it comes to a specific test, the answer is it depends. When you're talking about something like malware analysis, I look at a testing framework should be a combination of, does it catch known bad? Okay. Does it catch mysterious, maybe bad, and does it flag on false positives, and then having multiple samples through there. Talking about network samples, it's the same idea that you want to make sure that you're setting up a test population of such that you're testing those three buckets of, known good, unknowns, and known bads in order to make sure that you're getting coverage for both false positives, false negatives, and then trying to capture uncertainty. The number required to do that is a statistical question, which is going to depend on how large your sample set is, how, what confidence level you're shooting for in your results, and it will depend.
Sure. And to be clear, I wasn't talking about the number of tests, but the per test number of variables. An example being if you are judging the efficacy of some anti-exploitation technique and you deliver a payload and it doesn't successfully run, the question of whether your anti-exploit technique worked or whether you just failed because you were trying to use bin.sh on a Windows system.
Yes, so that's a good point, and that's going to come up in a couple of things that I'm talking about later on, but to frame it with that's where having realistic environmental testing, like a proof of concept, is vital, because in a situation like that, you've basically applied an inapplicable test to a system and come up with a wrong answer. So in the case that you're saying right now, it's not so much the number of variables, but the suitability of the variables, and then designing around so that you're covering your edge cases. Does that, you look unsatisfied, but that's the answer that I've got. Okay. So we talked about that. So who is it that you're trying to sell your testing criteria, or at least your evaluation, to? Well, chances are it's not you, the incident responder, or the SOC manager. Chances are it's someone whose title starts with a C, who maybe looks like this guy, who's going to be influenced by different data sets than what you're looking for. So the important thing in recognizing there is, for your audience, or for your ultimate decision maker, the person cutting the checks, is you need to educate them. You need to leverage what professional and institutional knowledge you have, how your environment works, how business decisions get made. Socialize with that management to make sure that your views are taken in and that the Gartner Magic Quadrant isn't the only thing that's influencing the discussion, and then make sure that they're on board with how you're tailoring measurements for your environment. So once you've done that, you still need to evaluate. You have recommendations and various other ideas coming in from very diverse sources. So in an ideal world scenario, going a little bit towards the question earlier, although not completely, is for every product you want an extensive proof of concept that's going to test out those edge cases so that you make sure that you're applying testing criteria that's relevant to your environment, and at the same time probing the edge cases around what it can do and what it can't do. So you have some idea of what its efficacy is and what its suitability is for what you're trying to deploy. The problem is that this takes an awful lot of time, even though it produces good answers. And going back to that slow procurement cycle, you might not have the resources, the people in question in order to really put something through a product like that. Ideally, your vendor should be working with you in order to make this easier to do and more of a, achievable reality, but that might not be the case, in which case maybe you should evaluate a different vendor. But anyway, a more realistic scenario is, ditch the objective ratings. Not completely, there's still data points, but evaluate them only in the scope of what they can usefully tell you. But leverage your existing professional relationships and your circles of trust. The opinions of those that you work with that you professionally respect and understand really matter. So that sort of word of mouth, it seems sort of artsy as opposed to sciencey, but nonetheless it has relevance in a discussion at this where we have less than perfect time, less than perfect resources to answer complex questions for which we have less than perfect information. Now you're saying, well, wait a minute, this is what I'm doing right now. Why is this a solution to a problem? Well, that's very true. We all operate in this way where we tap into our professional relationships in order to like, hey, what do you think about product XYZ? How does it work in your environment? Because I know that you're running something very similar to me. So yes, I am, because what I'm saying is that an objective evaluation would be great, and in fact, it really is needed. But within the current security environment, it just doesn't exist. It's not there today. So the result is that we should be pushing back against evaluations that don't match just reality in general, and more importantly, our specific instantiation of reality, our own networks, our own environments for which we're trying to protect. So basically, what we want to try and get after is, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, such that we are striving towards something that seems unobtainable, but at the same time we need to make decisions today. The takeaway from this is that we really do need some methodology of testing, whether it's antivirus software, security tools, et cetera, in a way that's sustainable, repeatable, and presumably objective. But each of these tests need to be at least industry or environment specific. So again, going back to the TRISIS example, something that's ICS specific isn't going to be very sensible for something like a financial services environment. There might be some overlap between the two, but chances are you're looking at completely different threat vectors, completely different threat actors that are operating there. So you need different ways of evaluating and judging how these products perform relevant to that information. Most importantly, it's almost dangerous to take the viewpoint that you have something that can operate objectively, yet there's flaws within the analysis. So taking, for example, the ICS detection challenge as being ground truth, and we can talk offline about how that test actually went since it ran 2 weeks ago, as being authoritative in how these things sort of operate, can be dangerous because it could lead you to bad answers. So rushing to adopt bad standards could be as dangerous, if not more dangerous, than not having any standards at all. Having false faith in something that doesn't actually deliver what it's promising can lead to a suboptimal decision-making process because you're injecting bad or unsuitable information that's influencing the decision and resulting in bad procurement ideas. I mean, ultimately, in a security product worst-case scenario, if you're evaluating something on information that's either irrelevant, doesn't make sense for how you're trying to apply things, you end up with a security product like our wonderful F-35 right here, which is a expensive, long gestation monstrosity that will never meet up to its expectations, but has passed every artificial test that's been thrown at it. So from an art into science perspective, right now we're really stuck in sort of an art perspective in how we do this, which is bad because we need something that's going to be scalable, objective in nature, yet still applicable to our environments. But we need to recognize that while there are people out there or institutions out there that are selling things that meet this scientific criteria for product evaluation, they're not there yet, and we need to recognize those biases and how things relate or don't relate to our own security applications or use cases, and make sure we base our decisions upon that complete set of information rather than simply trusting some white paper or other report as being ground truth in these matters. So with that, I'm done. We already had one question. I'm certainly open for more. Yes?
Testing environments, groups of folks, open source capabilities. Is there something that everyone kind of lumps in together that says, hey, I have a common problem, hey, I do too, let's get behind it, and we can set up a test and an experiment where it's transparent and not black boxed?
Right.
Yeah.
So probably the best sort of situation that's worked out for me in that scenario, and this goes back almost to like an ISAC idea, which ISAC can be, it's a 4-letter word, so yeah, we'll say it's a 4-letter word. But when I was in the Department of Energy, there was a sharing and collaboration group across the labs, which is amazing when you think about how Department of Energy operates, because everyone's kind of, on their own, different contractors, et cetera. But the Network Security Monitoring Group really looked at use cases and examples, and when we were trying to come up with ideas for like, okay, we need to revise our network detection perspective or whatever, like, I don't know, Bro, SourceFire, some other sort of application out there, vastly different products and ways of approaching the problem. I have limited time and limited data. What's your experience, Lawrence, Berkeley, you guys invented the dang thing, with this product, Bro, for example, or Sandia, how have you been doing with this idea? So it's going more towards a touchy-feely approach, and unfortunately, I don't know of a really good, like what you're talking about right now, and it's really just the recognition that those methods aren't there yet is kind of step one.
And just to follow up, does that, let's say, if that exists, we're not lost track, if it exists,
Yes. Mm-hmm.
and multiple organizations with a common issue could come together and run these experiments, how do you see this potentially impacting the Gartners, the Forresters, the 451s, kind of the more authoritative folks that some would argue might have more control or influence into the industry that could be kind of leading us into some of these directions that we might not want to go.
Right.
Does that undermine that effort? Does it
I think
bring
it
us
does.
into a higher order truth?
So I think it does undermine that effort because right now we're stuck in a, all AV products are the same. Well, it's like, well, they're not really the same. They're doing slightly different things. So I would almost look at this like automotive testing, for example. Yes, you have evaluations of like, here's a car, here's what it does, but you compare a Honda Civic to pick something really big. Hummers don't exist anymore. Some very large Ford. Like, well, they have some commonalities. They're both automobiles, but they're designed for different tasks. So within the class of compact cars, I want to make sure that I've got an understanding if that's what I'm looking for, or that's the sort of environment that I want. How do the different compacts compare to each other versus the pickup trucks? And right now, instead of being in that segmented market analysis where there might be some business case to be made for having the all versus all approach, but also then breaking things down into here's the application approach for medical, financial, industrial control is probably the way to go. Can a Forrester or a Gartner do that? I think if the effort and if the desire and the education on the part of users is there, that's a push-pull sort of effect where they can rise to the occasion. But I think it's going to take some pushback from the community to get them there in the first place.
Oh, any other questions? Oh.
Yeah, did you have a question? I thought I saw your hand.
Okay, I'll think up a question.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I saw your hand go up.
Oh. Oh, you were the one who had the hand up. I'm sorry.
How do you factor into your testing things such as longevity and flexibility of the market? That's where I see where in real-life industry we've got OpEx, CapEx decision-making issues. OpEx is highly flexible. CapEx is, you can't set and forget it anymore. So how do you build for the future?
Right, and that's an important test criteria that needs to be built into is the flexibility of the product, so to speak. So if you're talking about something that's a blacklisting approach, is that really something that's sustainable and scalable over time when you're talking about something that's going to sit in your environment for 5 years that, yes, with the way that it's working right now, it's fairly effective, but is there going to be support in terms of signatures and other sorts of items in order to make that a relevant product at the end of its life cycle versus something that is more iterative in development, some of your behavioral analytic approaches that can be more flexible. And I don't think that gets picked up in a lot of the evaluation just where it's like, hey, this caught 80+% or whatever of malicious samples. Like, well, okay, based upon what we know today, that's cool. But if we start talking about new techniques for either hardening, anti-analysis malware, et cetera, is that still going to be applicable a few years from now? Can that product evolve? It's tough to try and anticipate what those situations may be, but at the very least, getting some sense of what the capabilities and limitations, for that matter, are of just the overall product idea versus how it just performs today would be an important data point.
Hi there. I work for a vendor too, so I'm kind of curious about your take on this. The Anti-Malware Testing Standards Organization, is it helping? Is it hurting? Good idea, bad implementation? Good idea, good implementation? What are your thoughts there?
So, I mean, again, it's one of those things, it's a data point. I think it's always critical to try and evaluate it based upon, like, here's one measurement. it's useful for what it is, but let me understand what that criteria or what criteria are being leveraged in order to come up with that measurement. So from a vendor standpoint, my main thing would be, if I'm looking at my own product and I'm trying to sell it or at least describe it to someone else, appealing to the test as a means of validation, for example, can be quite dangerous, because if that test is designed for a use case outside of what you're trying to shoot for, it's not doing you very much good. Whereas similarly, if you're saying, hey, I did really good based upon this anti-mal or whatever measurement, is that really what your customer needs? So it's really adapting that message as well as adapting how you are positioning to match the use case, as opposed to matching just the artificial is kind of a harsh word, I guess, but the standard that's out there for which this result came from.
All right. Thanks, Joe. You're not privy to the Slack discussion, but there was a really active discussion while you were talking. And it's probably worth having this as a follow-up for tomorrow as well, a deeper dive on testing and evaluation. One of the topics that is going to be talked about over in the ops track, Frank Duff is going to talk about their methodology that they used in looking at EDR tools. You may have seen that blog post a few months ago. He's going to talk about that over in the ops track, but I've asked, if you're going to stay in the philosophy track, I've asked Frank to do an encore tomorrow as a prelude to a deep dive discussion around testing and evaluation frameworks. So Joe and Frank, I may ask you guys to help lead that discussion. NSS Labs is nearby, and I can also invite them if it makes sense for us to do that. So
Yes.
It'll be a very interesting discussion if we do that.
Yeah, and really at the end of the day, it's more identifying an issue that needs clarification instead of just poking fingers and saying, like, this sucks. But it's like, well, this is something that needs to be resolved.
Right,
So.
absolutely. And even though we may poke holes at Gardner and Forrester and NSS, ultimately we want to try to improve the posture here as well. So, okay.